horror fans, short story enthusiasts, horror short story likers. My name is Nate, and what the hell was that? If you're new to the channel, thank you for choosing this video to be background noise on your phone while you eat your dinner. If you're returning to this channel, also thank you. But you might be aware that my podcasting co-host Mike and I watched a Christmas horror movie last December, and I had the pleasure of interviewing writer/director/editor of that movie, Mike Lombardo. Link to that in the description. The reason I bring that up is because today's subject matter is a collection of short stories written by Mike Lombardo, including the short story that White Doomsday was based off of. I'd like to start off by stressing that this is not a paid sponsorship, although it could be. Come on, Mike, I know you're probably watching this, so I am not above chilling on the internet for cash. But all the same, I implore you to buy this book. Mike has made some really cool short films that you can check out on YouTube. He has a full-length film, White Doomsday, and now this book. As a fan of his work, your support would mean so much, and I can only imagine that it would mean even more to Mike himself. Not Mike, my podcasting co-host, by the way, Mike Lombardo. If you want my spoiler-free thoughts, then skip to the timestamp on your screen or use the chapters listed in the description. Although I also might just upload that section as a separate video in addition to this, because this is probably going to be a pretty long video. One more tiny note before I get into this. Spoiler alert! I will be spoiling everything about this book, so if you don't want to have everything spoiled, skip to those descriptions or watch the other separate video and do not continue. I repeat, I will be spoiling everything about this book, so if you haven't read these stories, stop watching and go read them. Or don't. I really don't care, as long as you and I have an understanding and you consider buying the book. Before we get into it though, I would like to stress that although I'm going to be pretty much recapping all of these stories, I don't think that that is a substitute for you actually reading these stories. If you like these stories as I described them, then I can only imagine that you will like them so much more when you read them in full detail as Mike Lombardo wrote. Alright, let's do this. Dead format. We begin with Kevin and Ben, discussing the art form of VHS porn amidst Kevin's vast VHS collection. We learn that Kevin is not only an avid VHS collector, but is also something of an archivist, who makes VHS copies of films that might otherwise be lost to time and adds them to his collection. Ben leaves to head for work, and Kevin uses this time to begin his archiving process using 2 VCRs. And as the VCR dubs the movie from one VHS to the other, Ben heads to the video store to search for more movies for his collection/archive. While searching, he comes across a horror movie that he's never heard of, and can't seem to find any info on it on Google. The movie seems like your generic slasher film, and it's called Next to Die. The clerk, while not familiar with the movie and knowing that it's definitely not something that came from his store, still has no problem selling it to VHS enthusiast Kevin. He goes back home to find his earlier archiving project complete, and after a short bit of self-reflection and a viewing of Nympho Nights on VHS, he decides to check out the big mystery from his video store haul. It appears to be just another disappointing low-budget slasher as expected, but inexplicably, Kevin keeps watching. Slowly, as Kevin watches the film, nearly every aspect of it seems to increase in quality. By the second, it seems that the set looks less cheesy, the once cheap-looking costume of the killer looks more and more authentic, and the amateurish effects become increasingly authentic. Kevin is then mesmerized to see what looks like his neighborhood on the screen, but deduces that it's probably just a locally made indie film, which is why there's no info online. That is, until he sees his neighbor get disemboweled by the killer specter on his screen. He looks outside to see his dead neighbor and the specter beelining it straight to his house. Kevin realizes that the deaths he had seen in the movie were deaths of previous viewers, and if he didn't act fast, he would be among them. He tries to barricade the door to no avail as the specter breaks through with ease. It swings its sight at Kevin, who narrowly avoids his doom, but falls into his VCR, damaging it. Kevin sits for a few painful moments waiting for his end to come, but instead he finds the specter to be frozen in place, and turns to see that in his fall, the video had frozen. Desperately, Kevin tries to stop or eject the tape, but the VCR is too damaged, so he rewinds the tape to find that the killer himself is rewinding. The door pieces itself back together, and Kevin sees his neighbor killed in reverse shortly before the tape begins to play again. He frantically tries to pause the movie, but the button falls off the VCR, forcing Kevin to find another way to defend himself. Thinking that there's really no way out, he reflects back on a life that some might call a waste. But during his reminiscing, he remembers sometimes buying a VHS, only to find out that some asshole had recorded over part of it with something else. That memory gives him an idea, as he prays that the second VCR used for dubbing tapes is still connected to the broken one. He grabs his ever-so-useful tape of Nympho Nights and begins to overwrite Next to Die just as the door is destroyed once again. He looks through the doorway to see the star of Nympho Nights there to greet him. His life saved, he stares at the adult film star in his doorway, but doesn't hesitate to eject Nympho Nights and replace it with a home video entitled Family Christmas '94, ending the story. I'm dreaming of a white doomsday. Kelly Ank swallows a cookie topped with weed killer as she prepares another cookie for her 9-year-old son who's playing with his new Ninja Turtle toy that he got for Christmas. Kelly remembers a happier time that feels like so long ago before giving the cookie to her son Riley as we learn that Christmas is being spent in a bomb shelter. Outside of the shelter, there are only ashes of the world that was, and wading through that ash is a being of legend, Santa. Santa checks his magic scroll to see only one name left, Riley Ank. Anyone else who believes in him is gone. Santa continues to travel and sees only what monsters could have survived the end of the world, and even passes by a man who is eating the remains of another person who vaguely senses Santa's presence but is not able to see him, and Santa looks at him and is able to see the innocent child this man once was. But that fades and Santa moves on. We're brought back to a time not too long ago when Kelly makes the hard decision of ending the lives of her and her son to end their suffering as they're starving in this bunker, but decides to let him have one final Christmas. They decorate the bunker with what little they have, and Riley asks Kelly if she thinks his dad is ever going to come back. We learn that Riley's father had left to search for supplies over 2 months ago and had never returned. So desperate for anything to keep them going, Kelly ventured out one time, leaving Riley alone, but returned with a meager amount of supplies that she had gotten from her surviving neighbor who also had a bomb shelter. The food and water didn't really last, and we can infer that she had to sleep with her neighbor to get those supplies. She later returns to make that same exchange out of desperation, only to find the neighbor gone and his bunker in a very eerie state. She grabs what little food and water she can and never returns to that bunker. That was 2 weeks before Christmas, but now Christmas is here, and Riley opens the last gift he'll ever get while Santa trudges on to find Riley. Kelly and Riley drift to sleep as Kelly dreams of being with her husband and son taking Christmas photos as the dream slowly becomes a nightmare. She then wakes up to see Riley sitting and staring out of the now open bunker door. Riley exclaims that Santa found them while a confused Kelly panics and tries to get Riley away from the strange man. Riley then leads Santa into the bunker. If you think that this story might actually have a happy ending, you are sadly mistaken, because Santa grabs Riley by the throat and starts choking the life out of him. Kelly tries in vain to stop Santa, who just throws her against the wall, which ends up paralyzing her from the waist down. Santa kills Riley, and then he himself explodes into ash as the last believer in him is gone, and he can now die. Kelly mourns the loss of her child, as through the open bunker door, some slithering horror creeps toward her. Appetites. This, while particularly short, is one that's not for the faint of heart. And I won't go into much graphic detail, although, even still, if you decide to skip it, there are chapters in the description. Trigger warning for sexual assault. Last warning to skip in 3, 2, 1. A woman is assaulted by a man who she meets on an online dating site when what started as a consensual act turns gruesome, leaving her unconscious. The man then takes her unconscious body and pushes it into a section of the room that's been marked off. The wall on that side of the room seems to be some kind of living monster, from which tendrils come out, eventually entering the skin in her arm, which immediately wakes her up, and she tries to escape with no avail. The tendrils go inside of her and seemingly eat her from the inside, leaving only a husk of a body. Tendrils then drag the remains of the body to the wall, and then it seemingly melds into the wall itself. The man cleans himself and begins scrolling through the dating website once more. The world in the window. Chris lays in his bed, a wreck, after the funeral of his girlfriend Jen. We learn that the two had been in a very serious relationship, and Jen traveled to Rome to study abroad for her senior year in art school. Despite the distance, the two stayed extremely close, video chatting every single day without fail, and Chris had plans to propose to her when she came home. But unfortunately, she was struck by a negligent driver and died. Several days after the funeral, during an intense period of mourning, Chris goes to his laptop and feels the urge to attempt to video call Jen, despite how ridiculous it seems. By some miracle, the call is answered by Jen, and while Chris is confused and questions if it's real, he quickly casts those thoughts aside and decides to just enjoy it, real or not. The two talked for hours as if nothing had changed, and as the morning approached, the connection seemed to break up a little bit. Eventually, the connection grows even worse as Chris begs for the call not to end, and they reminisce about their first date. Jen tells Chris that she loves him and their memories will always be there, but he needs to continue living his life. The call ends and Chris's life goes on. No comment. We open to see writer Brian Keene warding off a reporter from his home with a gun. We learn that Brian had initially agreed to an interview, but came to regret it after being called a necrophobe, and we learn that his first novel was a book about zombies. Hi, Editing Nate here. It was supposed to say that zombies in this universe are considered somewhat of a subjugated group, but I guess I deleted that footage. So now you know. An idea that Brian himself scoffs at. Brian lives in a secluded area to avoid interaction with the public, which he has a growing disdain for. However, it doesn't stop the occasional trespasser, including one that Brian nearly beat to death some time ago. He tries to unwind after the interview gone south and continues to work on his latest non-zombie book, but keeps hearing noises outside, which he assumes to be more trespassers, and goes to investigate. He goes outside and smells a putrid odor, which is so bad that it causes him to vomit. Once he regains his composure, he looks out to see a figure completely omitted by shadows, despite standing directly under floodlights. Brian warns the figure to leave, but eventually shoots the figure twice with seemingly no effect until shooting it in the head and the figure falls. He investigates the body to find that the body was not covered by shadows, but swarmed by flies, and it's wearing a gas mask and a pin for the zombie advocacy group. As he stands over this body, his cell phone rings, causing the mass of flies to fly. This causes him to stumble back, stepping into the vomit, then causing himself to slip and hurting himself to a degree that he can't get up. He screams for help, but living in such a secluded area, no one but a horde of zombies hear his cry, and they come and finish him off. Please don't tap on the glass. A man and his mother take a trip to the emergency room. The mother has had life-threatening complications before, and due to a recent sickness, fearing a sort of regression, they go to the ER. The two nervously wait, but their company comforts each other. That is, until the mother is taken to get care for, and the man is left alone, and he grows increasingly anxious. To take his mind off the matter, as best as he can, he wanders the waiting room to find that there's a fish tank with seemingly disformed and otherwise just unhealthy-looking fish, with a sign on the tank asking viewers not to tap the glass. The man observes several times a family would come through the door and then seemingly grieve the loss of a loved one that didn't make it, and the fish would seem to swarm to that side of the tank closest to those doors. He noticed the patient get wheeled through those same doors, but the patient doesn't really seem too distraught about his situation, and the fish don't really seem to pay any mind. However, shortly after that, an old woman fears for the life of her husband, who is being wheeled back, and the fish swarm once again. The man notices this strange phenomenon and thinks that these fish are somehow feeding off of grief, but shortly after succumbs to anxious thoughts of his mother's well-being, and then he himself walks to the doors hoping to see her. As he gets to the door, he notices the fish swarm, and he feels a very faint sensation all around. But shortly after, his mother comes through the door, saying that it was only a stomach bug and the sensation fades. The mother goes to sign the discharge papers, and the fish seem to have almost grown. The two leave as the man hears a woman in the waiting room sobbing and grieving, but doesn't turn around to check the fish. Hard times at the Opium Den. We get introduced to Mike Lombardo and his colorful roommates living at the house they affectionately call the Opium Den. And we're told how Mike's roommate starts the apocalypse. We hear about the hard times they've gone through and how they've made it through. We learn that his roommate Andrea has been swiping Viagra from her job at CVS. Then they sell that on the street and then replace the legit pills with ones that her husband Phil makes in his homemade drug manufacturing lab. At some point, a spider gets trapped inside the microwave and gets microwaved during some of this manufacturing, which then taints a batch of the drugs. Through a series of unfortunate events, Andrea's husband Phil bakes some tainted cookies, which all of Mike's household, barring himself because he was getting tattooed, consumes. Mike comes home after a 6-hour session of getting his leg tattooed to find a friend of the house cocooned to the wall, and Phil and Andrea have been morphed into some kind of monster. Mike runs away to find his other roommate monsterified, and Mike tries to escape but is caught pretty quickly. And we learn that he is explaining all of this to us, another victim of his roommates, both of us cocooned to the wall and impregnated by a mutant spider. And now all we can do is just sit here and wait to see how it ends for us. Just like the real thing. Another one that might be a bit rough for the faint of heart because of gore, but again, I won't get into the detail too much. But you can skip if you want. Last warning in 3, 2, 1. Lee turned 18 today. And after much anticipation, he sneaks out of the house at night to ride his bike 30 minutes to the sex shop downtown. Lee goes in to find pretty much all the videos to be a little bit too, shall we say, hardcore compared to what he expected. And we even get a callback to the earlier story, Appetite. Lee thinks to leave, but he promised his friend Brandon that he would be bringing something back, and he knew he couldn't be coming back empty-handed. He asks the person behind the counter for a Playboy, and he notices a man across the store staring at him uncomfortably. Lee buys a Girls Gone Wild tape, and then leaves, but finds that the man who was staring at him followed him out. And the man then offers him some cans that resemble some sort of adult toys that are directed towards heterosexual men, if you get what I'm saying. And after some sort of hesitation, Lee takes them. Lee goes home and he uses the cans and seems to be almost transported into some very vivid fantasy, finishing to find that inside of the can is some kind of living thing, leaving his stuff covered in blood. Home again. A short and semi-sweet one. A man stands in the house that he grew up in and remembers all the wonderful times that he spent in that house. Aww. Before we learn that the family currently living at the home has been killed and hidden in the nearby woods. Weekend at Escobar's. We have another rough one here. I won't get into too much detail, of course, and here's the timestamp to skip to, and if you want, there is the chapter selection in the description below. Last chance to skip. 3, 2, 1. Jason Roberts finds himself at the Mexican border with a dead body stuffed full of drugs in the passenger seat of a car, and we go on to learn how Jason found himself in this situation. Jason, who was a vagabond, found himself in a small town in Texas, where he started working in a dingy bar for room and board. He hits it off well with his boss Julio, and one night while closing the bar, Jason overhears an argument coming from Julio's office. But since Jason doesn't speak much Spanish, he can't make out what's said before a frightened-looking man hurries out of Julio's office and right out of the bar. Jason makes his way into Julio's office to see what happened, and a seemingly distraught Julio has his mood quickly changed and offers Jason a job as a sort of delivery man. It's quickly revealed that Jason will be a drug mule, and after some haggling about his rate, he agrees to do the job. The next morning, Jason rides nervously over the Mexican border with Julio until they make it to a beautiful home, and Julio tells him, "Welcome to Escobar's." They make their way inside, where Julio introduces Jason to Escobar, and they see all the amenities that you might expect from pop culture in a drug lord's house as Escobar welcomes them into his home. He says they'll do business in the morning, and they all enjoy said amenities. A very impaired Jason searches for a bathroom in Escobar's sprawling home, but finds himself in Escobar's office, where he relieves himself into a potted plant before accidentally discovering a sort of secret doorway hidden in a bookshelf, where he then enters and is astounded to find himself in what seems like a movie set. Only after some investigation, he learns that it's not just any film set, it is a film set of the adult variety. He proceeds to look around the set to find the usual props, but eventually finds an assortment of knives, a cattle prod, and a baseball bat decked with nails. And upon further inspection, it had been recently used, which leads Jason to notice the drain in the floor that's stained red. As Jason realizes the purpose of the set, still holding the baseball bat that he was examining, a not-so-enthused Escobar finds him, and then has him at gunpoint, shouting about someone named Gonzalez sending Jason to kill him. Jason pleads that he doesn't even know anyone named Gonzalez, and he wandered in here while he was looking for the bathroom, but Escobar just doesn't believe it, and just as he's about to pull the trigger, Julio walks in the doorway, causing Escobar to aim at him, and without thinking, Jason swings the bat he's holding and kills Escobar. Julio reveals that Escobar wasn't exactly his friend, and he takes the key from his body and then opens a cabinet that stashed cash and drugs. Jason sits in shock for a few moments before realizing that Julio knew exactly where to look for the drugs and the money on this snuff film set, and concludes that he must have some involvement. He then grabs Escobar's gun and raises it to Julio. He tries to question Julio about his involvement, but Julio is able to convince him that their time is better spent figuring out how to get out of here. After a short period of contemplation, Jason gets the idea to stuff the drugs into Escobar's corpse. They do just that, and they use the costumes on the set to redress the corpse, and do their best to make it seem like Escobar just had too much to drink. They try to make it through the party, but the other drunk partygoers are trying to talk to their host, but Julio does well enough to redirect the guests for them to make it through. They make it to the car, but Jason drops the keys, which then leads him to realize a trail of blood behind them, and it doesn't take long for Escobar's men to start shooting at them. But Julio returns fire, He gets shot in the shin before making it into the car as they drive off. They eventually make it to the border, and Julio bribes the Border Patrol officer, and they think that they're in the clear before seeing suited men with guns approach their car as they get boxed in. Julio makes a run for it, but is tackled to the ground. And before Jason can even process what's going on, he gets pistol whipped and knocked out. Jason has a dream that picks up from a memory that we learned about of him going on a roller coaster with his father. But in this dream, the tracks are in ruins at the bottom, and when he reaches the bottom, Jason finds himself uninjured, and he then finds a treasure map which belonged to his younger brother. Jason confronts the fact that he's been on the run to escape facing something that happened to his younger brother, that we've gotten slight allusions to throughout the story, and I haven't mentioned yet. We learn that years ago, Jason sent his pirate-obsessed little brother on a treasure hunt while he played baseball with his friends. The makeshift home plate was a duct-taped X in the driveway, which Jason's little brother assumed to be the endpoint of his treasure hunt, running to it just as Jason was swinging the bat, striking him and leaving him severely handicapped for the rest of his life. His family understands it to be an accident and doesn't blame him at all, but all aspects of their lives declined, until Jason decides to run away at 17. Jason's dream then concludes with him digging through dirt and blood to find the treasure that he promised his little brother all those years ago. Jason wakes up in Escobar's studio surrounded by suited men as one introduces himself as Gonzalez. Jason asks where Julio is, and then is shown what can only be described as a very brutal torture and execution video of Julio, done in the very same room that they're standing in. Gonzalez explains that these videos are made for very wealthy clientele, who are interested in a very particular sort of content. Seeing that Jason seems to be somewhat talented given what he had done to Escobar, Gonzalez gives Jason the choice of being on either the giving end or the receiving end of these videos going forward, as the story ends. Play Place. This one starts off with a dream sequence that is super cool, and I'm not even going to try to describe it to you because you should go read it. Aaron Warner wakes up from this dream and then thinks about his upcoming graduation, which this dream made very clear he is very anxious about. He feels like he has no direction, and we learn that his family is very adamant that he is going to college. At the end of the day, he didn't really know what he wanted, but when he explained this to his father, he got forced to get a job. Aaron then receives a call from his manager at McDonald's, ordering him to come into his shift hours early. He gets to work, and just as he's about to walk into the employees only section, he sees a man in a gas mask and a trench coat from across the street, holding a cardboard sign that says the end is near. The man turns to look at Aaron, who quickly goes through the employee-only door, where we briefly meet one of Aaron's coworkers, Nick, who is otherwise known as Sarge to Aaron. He gets to work and has an unpleasant interaction with a customer, but is a good fast food worker and keeps his cool, but still gets reprimanded by his boss. The next customer is also an asshole, and takes it a step too far by calling him lazy. And then he cusses her out for it, and she leaves with her son. His boss screams at him, and Aaron expects the relief of being free from McDonald's as he's fired. But instead, Mark, his boss, decides to give him a fate even worse. He has to clean the play place. Aaron enters the play place and begins to clean while cursing the horrors of working at McDonald's, and once again fears that his life has no real direction. He decides he'll finish cleaning as to not give his boss the satisfaction of breaking him down, and then he'll quit before the bastard has a chance to fire him and deal with whatever consequences come from his parents. Aaron uses his higher vantage point to look over his coworkers, where he sees his crush and imagines working up the courage to ask her out. While watching over the dining room, he sees what was the husband of the first unpleasant customer encounter stumble into the restaurant in tattered clothes, with what seems to be wet paint on. The guy then takes a chunk out of the boss's throat. More zombie-like people flood into the restaurant, and carnage ensues. Aaron watches over all of this and tries to rationalize what's happening, until he hears a scream coming from his crush, Moira. He sees her and Sarge fighting back zombies, and Aaron attempts to get the attention of his coworkers, thinking that the play place would be a safe place for them, considering the lack of dexterity and motor skills that the zombies are displaying. He manages to get their attention, and they make their way to him, narrowly making it up the slide, escaping some zombies. They all sit in the largest chamber of the play place. After realizing that they can't stay up here forever with no food or water, they plan what to do next. During the earlier chaos, Sarge dropped his phone before being able to call 911. And Moira is noticing that all the zombies are congregating to the slide, where they last saw a person. Moira then plans to use herself as bait while the others go to the dining room and get the phone to call for help. Sarge and Aaron go on with the plan and gain somewhat of a mutual respect for one another, when we learn that Sarge wants to go to culinary school and is just being forced to enlist in the military because of familial pressure. They go on with the plan and descend down the slide and make much more noise than intended, and they get the attention of a few of the zombies. But they quickly proceed with the mission. They reach the phone, and as Sarge picks it up, a corpse grabs his ankle. But before anyone can react, a car goes through the wall, sending Aaron to the floor, and pieces of rubble hitting Sarge and essentially destroying his ribcage. As Aaron gets up, he sees the victims from earlier turn into zombies themselves and start to make their way for Sarge, who begs for help. But Aaron ignores him and gets the phone, knowing that Sarge can't make it out alive, and then says he's sorry, only for Sarge's last words to come out as, "You bastard." Aaron races to the slide as Sarge is devoured by the horde. And when Aaron reaches the slide, he realizes how close Moira was to the car that crashed through the wall, and he desperately searches for her. He eventually sees her body, and zombies were heading towards it. Aaron begins to break down before hearing her screams and realizing that she's not dead. Aaron goes into a rage and kills all the zombies making their way towards her, and then they make it to the play place. While in the safety of the play place, we see that Moira's leg is bleeding. She thanks him for saving her, and she kisses him. Aaron then tells her the news about Sarge, and when he tries to tell her that it was his fault, she refuses to let him blame himself. They use the phone to call 911 to see that it's busy, and then they see the news on the TV in the dining room showing the world outside is also in chaos. The two then talk about the future that they wanted for themselves, and Moira tells Aaron that she was waiting for him to ask her out. The two end up kissing and then sleeping together, and then afterwards Aaron can't help but take his mind off the inevitable end before falling asleep holding her. He wakes to find Moira dead, and then he buries her in the ball pit, while the other undead stand on one side of netting that could easily break just watching. He sits there and waits as Moira turns and then makes her way to him. We then cut to sometime later where we're following two survivors as they make their way into the McDonald's in hopes of finding supplies. The two are perplexed to see that there was clearly a gruesome event that happened here, but they can't find bodies of any kind. They eventually hear the sound of something rubbing against the plexiglass looking glass thing of the play place, and then they see a now turned Aaron pawing at them. One of the survivors takes aim, ready to end Aaron, who once said that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in this place, before the other survivor stops her, saying that they can't afford to waste ammo. Congratulations! We made it through these grotesque and melancholic stories. Now, I may seem biased because I think Mike Lombardo is a nice guy, but I really enjoyed these stories. There's really so much range in the entire collection that I feel confident that within this book there's at least one story that I can recommend to nearly everyone I know, horror fan or not. I think they're all written in a really natural way that never has me feeling like I'm reading something pretentious or something where characters act in a way that's just not believable. I think when people imagine reading horror books, they kind of picture something like, but really I think in some ways reading horror is almost more effective. There's something about having to picture the things you read in your mind, and your brain just fills in the gaps in such a way that you get all this detail. And I think to some extent that's much more effective than just being shown an image of something scary or disturbing. I consider myself to be a pretty big horror fan, and there's definitely some stuff in here that had me reeling, in a good way. I also can't really understate how much I appreciate the story notes at the end of each story. I wish that this was something that I'd see more, because I really think it deepens the appreciation of the stories. We're now going to get into my quick thoughts on all the stories in this book. If you made it through the entire full-length video, then congratulations, and you don't have to worry about anything being spoiled anyway. But if you skip to this part, or if you're watching the standalone abridged video that is just my thoughts, then don't worry, nothing's going to be spoiled. Dead format. I think that this was the perfect introduction to the collection out of all the stories here. I think you kind of get a little bit of all the different tones throughout the collection here, and it's one that I really like. I'm dreaming of a white Doomsday. Now, as much as I love the film, I honestly think this is even better. The setting of this one is really one that's really terrifying, and you really feel the hopelessness and the sense of unknowing that the characters feel. Appetites. This one really fucked me up. This one has the potential to ruin your day, and I think that this story is the one that lingered in my mind the most. And I'd say it's probably the most disturbing of the collection. I like this one, but I know that I can't recommend it to everybody. Window in the World. Now, this is one that I can recommend to everyone. Tragic and beautiful story that I've already recommended to a lot of friends. No comment. Honestly, this one is probably the weakest of the bunch for me personally. It's not bad at all, but I feel like it doesn't really do anything particularly unique. With that being said, however, once I read the story notes, the concept of the story was a lot more appealing to me because of the origin of why it was written. Like, that really seems like a really fun concept and something that I'd want my friends to do for me. Please Don't Tap on the Glass. Yet another one that I feel like I can recommend to just about everyone. It's a super interesting one, and anyone can relate to grieving and feeling like something is being taken out of you. Hard Times at the Opium Den. Towards the beginning of this story, it was kind of losing me. But honestly, I think that was more because of the style in which the story's told. But once you reach the end, I think the payoff is worth it, and it's a pretty funny story. Just like The Real Thing. I think this does a really good job at painting an exaggerated picture to the very real danger of addiction to explicit content. Home Again. When I was writing the script for this, I realized that I actually didn't put my thoughts for this one because I skipped over it somehow. All the same, I think it's a good one. I think, again, out of this collection, probably bottom of the list for me personally. It's kind of in the same vein as No Comment, where there's nothing super unique about it, but all the same, it's still kind of fun and made me like grin and smirk and have a good time reading it. Weekend at Escobar's. Another really good one. I'd say maybe even one of the best of the collection. I can totally see the ending turning some people off, but I think it's a fitting end for a tragedy. Play Place. A cool closing piece. It's obviously far from the first story to tackle the subject matter, but the setting is extremely unique, and I think it makes it stand out pretty well. I'd like to again remind you to please go and buy a copy and support Mike Lombardo. I actually just pre-ordered my hardcover copy, so I'm probably going to burn this useless paperback one. Make sure to also check out Mike Lombardo's short films, which you can watch here on YouTube at Reel Splatter Productions. And also pick up a copy of his full-length film, I'm Dreaming of a White Doomsday, which again is an adaptation of one of the stories in this collection. You can even hear me talk about it in more detail on the podcast with my co-host Mike Clark and our buddy Evan Kitt. Plus, there's an interview that I did with Mike Lombardo that you can listen to as well. Also, if schedules line up, you might be able to see Mike Lombardo as a guest in our traditional fashion on the podcast, where we watch a movie together and then talk about it. Thank you for watching, and thanks again for Mike for writing this book and exposing me to a new world of horror content. Thanks, bye!